Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, and today I am making two cards using My Favorite Things Recipe for Happiness stamp set. This is the new Birdie Brown set for their February release, and I'd stamped every image from the set onto a piece of Neenah Solar White 110-pound cardstock with Simon Says Stamp New Intense Black ink, which is formulated for use with alcohol-based markers. So I've never used this ink before and tried it out, and basically from my first try I can say I really like it. I plan on using it some more. It doesn't smear, as you can see. It's stamped perfectly. Yeah, I'm really happy with it. So I stamped every single image, lining them all up with my MISTI. I just did a video showing that, how to line up the stamped images to coordinate with the die set, so you don't have to cut apart the die set, and you can stamp and then die cut everything in one pass. I'll show the die cutting in a couple minutes here. And once they were stamped, I'm going to color all of them in with my Copic markers. I'm doing the same color scheme with all of them. With these sorts of images, it's kind of perfect and easy because most chefs obviously wear white, so it kind of just makes this go a lot faster. Yeah, I used cool grays to add some shadows and shading and some definition to his chef's coat and his little hat, and I started with the darkest and worked my way to the lightest, and only added the grays in like the shadowy areas, basically with the idea that the light source was coming from the upper right. So I just turned the cardstock for those images that are upside down, and they're only stamped like that just so that I can run them through the die machine, because that's how the dies were organized. And I used C5, C3, C00, and then I used my colorless blender to finally blend it all out for his hats. And for his skin, I just used E13, E21, E50, and I'd used R20 for his little cheeks. And then for the red, normally I kind of stick to the same combos. It's time for me to really start going out of my box, basically. And so for this one, I started with R89 and then went in with R27 and R24. And while I was at it, I did the handles of the little tools in the set too, to add a little bit of red, just for an extra little pop of color. And I've sped up the coloring on this just because otherwise this video would be quite a bit longer, and yeah, just insanely long, and it would take me like 3 days to upload it. So colored everything in at the same time on these images. This also kind of speeds up the process and really helps if you're like mass producing or just wanting to make several cards at once. And then I went on and did his little mustache, and I used E29, E27, and E25 for that. And while I haven't been using my Copics as much lately, it's been quite a while really. I've been so obsessed with watercoloring and everything else. The one thing I have been really enjoying though when I do use them is I like just going from darkest to lightest. I'm finding it used to be back in the day when I do a lot of Copic coloring, I'd go from lightest to darkest, back to lightest to blend everything out. And I find it saves me a lot of time if I just go from darkest to lightest, and then the lighter colors just blend out the darker, and it just makes things go a lot quicker. So for the metal instruments and then also for his feet, I just used the same cool grays, but instead I added C8 and C7 to darken them up a fair bit more. So, and the buttons on his little outfit. The buttons I just did the C8 and C7, and then everything else I did C8, 7, and then I added some 5, some 3, and then finally some C0 to blend them out and finish them off. So then I got out my Big Shot, and I have the magnetic platform with one cutting plate, the stamped images, and then the coordinating die set lined up over top, so then I can die cut all of these images in one pass through my machine. So get those all die cut, and you could do whatever you want with this. You could make 4 cards if you wanted, or 4 tags, that sort of thing. I decided to make 2. I was doing this for this week's Color Throwdown challenge, which the info on that will be in my blog post. And I colored all of the images because one, it was easier, and two, I can use a couple images on the inside of the card. So for the outside of the card, I'm using the new mini hexagon background using Hero Art's Unicorn white pigment ink. So inked up the stamp, and then I'm using some MFT steel gray cardstock and pressing that onto there, so I've got that stamped. And since I had it out, I just grabbed a baby wipe to clean off all the pigment ink and wipe off all the ink with that, and then I just rub my hands on it to remove any of the moisture from the baby wipe. And then I ink up the stamp a second time, this time with MFT steel gray ink, the dye ink. So ink that up, and then I'm going to stamp it onto some white cardstock. So get the white cardstock lined up, and then put a piece of scratch paper on there to keep the ink from getting all over my hands. And then once I've got that stamped, I'm going to run both of these through my die cut machine with the new inside note stitched rectangle stacks dynamics. I used the largest one on the white piece of cardstock and then the second largest on the steel gray. So ran that through. And then while I had my machine out, I die cut some vellum with the inside note stitch circle stacks and some red cardstock with the sentiment strips dynamics, which I had already sized up with a couple of sentiments that I wanted to use from the set, and both of these dies happen to just fit perfectly with the stamp sentiments. So I cut, after I cut them, I coated each of the die cuts with my anti-static powder tool. I'm sorry, my head gets in the way here for a second. And then stamped each of the sentiments with the same unicorn pigment ink. You could stamp them with Versamark, but I had the pigment ink sitting here and it works just as well. So stamped the sentiments, and then I coated them with detail white embossing powder. And once the embossing powder was melted with my heat tool, I let it cool off for a few seconds and then rubbed my fingers against them to remove that anti-static powder, because it just leaves that like white film on the cardstock. And then I kind of figured out how I was going to create these card fronts and the layout, and then set those aside for a second and grabbed a full sheet of 8.5 by 11 heavyweight white cardstock. And I just lined it up on my Fiskars trimmer at 5.5 inches, which I didn't realize was kind of off camera, and scored the entire piece of cardstock there at 5.5 inches. And then I turned it and cut the cardstock in half at 4.25 inches. So then I've got both card bases made at once, A2 size, so 4.25 by 5.5. And then to adhere my first little card front here, I just used my ATG for the sentiment and for the little chef, and I adhered those first to the vellum circle. That way I can apply the adhesive behind those images so that it doesn't show through at all, and then adhered that to the little panel there. And I just added the vellum just to kind of soften that little bit of area where the chef was going to go, because the background is kind of intense with the steel gray ink. And then I decided to adhere all the little tools with some multimedia matte, and then pop that up with some foam tape onto my card front. And then I kind of did the same thing with the second piece. I just adhered all these little guys and the sentiment with my ATG adhesive, and added the two pots that I had stamped and die cut as well. And then once those were all adhered, I did the same thing, popped all this up on some foam tape, and then popped that onto my card front. And with this one, I decided to add some enamel dots. So I have some Doodlebug Ladybug red enamel dots. So I added 3 of those to this one, just to kind of bring in a little bit more of that red. And then for the inside of the cards, I used these last 2 little chefs that I had colored already. And the one I added the coordinating little sentiment because it just kind of seemed to go together perfectly. So stamped the sentiment in the center kind of the card there, and again use my multimedia matte to adhere the little stamped images, because it was convenient. I always just grab for whatever adhesive is convenient. So adhered the second little chef. This one I didn't add any sentiments from the set. I just kind of left it open-ended so you could just write whatever you wanted to the recipient, and that finished off the cards. So as always, there will be links below the video in the description box. There will be links to all the supplies used, as well as a link to my blog post. If you're interested in the color challenge or any of that sort of info, all that info will be on my blog, along with links to that. Thank you all so much for watching, subscribing, thumbs upping my videos. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope to see you all very soon in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.